So if you're like me, you like to keep track as best as you can of where your money is going. And it's the same whether it's my personal finances or government finances. I want to make sure that the money is well spent and it's actually going to the things that I would like it to go to. So, I don't want to have a $200 budget for groceries and find out that only $30 actually went to groceries, or that all of the $200 went to buying snacks. Now, this is something that is very important, and two MPs took up the task with regards to some foreign aid that Canada is making donations to. Now, the two MPs are Peter Kent and Marty Morans, who asked Minister Karina Gould about Canada's funding to UNRWA. Now, UNRWA is the United Nations Relief Works Agency for Palestine and the Near East, and it is responsible for providing care for Palestinian refugees. Now, we'll get into Palestinian refugees in just a minute, but let's talk about the aid for a second. Now, there's a background here that Canada basically pledged $90 million over the next 3 years for UNRWA, so for the Relief Works Agency for Palestine, and that is supposed to provide basic education, health, social services to Palestinian refugees. That's $75 million over 3 years, and then the rest is for additional refugees created by the Syrian war. Now, this is going to operate in places like the West Bank, Gaza, Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan. So, a couple of problems with this entire thing. First of all, UNRWA has been repeatedly found to promote anti-Semitic material in its educational materials. So, for example, this latest report shows that the children are being given exercises, math exercises, and writing exercises about pieces of corpses being strewn throughout the streets, and that's, a spelling test or an English test or, some kind of test. They also strictly refer to Israel as the enemy or the occupation, the occupier, and it's pretty much removed from all maps. So there is and never was in Israel, it's strictly Palestine. Now, not only does this type of education make it more difficult for there to be peace in the region, since you have an entire generation, or possibly generations by now, of kids growing up to believe that there never was in Israel, that Israel has absolutely no legitimacy in the region, that every single person there is an occupier, which is, it's untrue. My family, for example, is from the Middle East. So, this is something that Canada is funding, and we should be concerned. But what is it about UNRWA? Something I think slipped by a lot of people when I read this the first time, and this is where this money is going to be used. And it is places like the West Bank, Gaza, Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan. So go through them one by one. The West Bank. Now, most of that where Palestinian lives, most of that areas where Palestinians live, that is actually under the governance of the Palestinian Authority. So that's the Palestinian government, and one might wonder why they need a UN agency if they have their own government. Now, fine, they might be providing aid or something, but all right, it's still a question, something to look deeper into. Same thing with Gaza. Now, Gaza is run by Hamas, which is considered a terrorist organization in Canada. And so, all right, you might say the people there, they have serious problems. Maybe they, are lacking some basic services. But you may recall from a previous video where the issue of Gaza came up, and there's an ongoing hashtag, you can look it up on Twitter, called the Gaza You Don't See. And it shows all of the expensive things being brought into Gaza. And so, obviously there's an issue, but there's also a large disparity between the haves and have-nots in Gaza. So, again, it's not as simple as just the UN is providing money and every single person there is a refugee. But the other big ones that should be really confusing to a lot of people are Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan. And so you might ask, why are there Palestinian refugees from the original 1948 war, or even the 67 war, which is slightly more recent? Why are there Palestinian refugees in Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan? That would be like, someone who was a refugee from that war moving to Canada and remaining a Palestinian refugee, never getting citizenship, never becoming, Syrian, Jordanian, or Lebanese. That's because of a couple things. Number one, it's because of how UNRWA defines its refugees. It defines refugees as anyone who is a descendant of the people who were forced to vacate their homes if they lived in that area in the 1948 war, or also in the 67 war. So you could be a descendant, your grandfather could have been there, and you still count as a refugee. That's very, very different from the UNHCR, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, where you would lose your refugee status in many cases if you became a citizen or you lived in another country and you're a permanent resident now. You're not a stateless person. You're not a refugee. You have been set up in some fashion. So for the Palestinian agency, you don't really ever lose your refugee status, where the normal refugee agency for all other refugees in the world, except for Palestinians, you would lose your refugee status somehow. So this is sort of one problem. But the other problem is the fact that those three countries, Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan, basically have kept those people as refugees because they know that it will prolong the conflict, and it's a way to sort of punish Israel or to just use it as a political bargaining chip in international affairs. So they actually, in many countries, for example, in Lebanon, there's actually laws against what you can become as a profession if you are a Palestinian. So they have their own issues. And for Canada to be funding the UNRWA, the Palestinian United Nations Relief Works Agency for Palestine and the Near East, for us to be funding that money and not making sure that, A, they're not using this money to promote hate and do things that will harm any chance of peace in the future, because what they're doing is definitely harming any chance of peace in the future, and that the money is appropriately spent. So I think, you know, as Canadians, it's one thing if we want to have a discussion about foreign aid or international aid. We want to help out people who are in trouble, and I think there's a really good discussion for us to have about that. But if we do decide to send aid abroad, I think we all owe it to all of the taxpayers and everyone else in Canada to have that discussion and make sure that our money is going to be used appropriately. So that's pretty much it for this issue, and I think we can all agree, especially with the government spending a lot of money these days, we want to make sure it is being used appropriately. So, you know, for True North, I am Sam Eskenasi. Thank you so much for watching this video.